So I do want to emphasize this little bit about my title, because I think all of us involved in this enterprise have multiple appointments. And so with one half of my life, I'm running technology and publishing at the University of Michigan in the library, and the other half as the director of HathiTrust. And I think that's one of the points that we want to make in all of this, and I think it's true in the research center as well, that this is a part of us rather than a separate enterprise, that we are building this from and within ourselves, extending what we're doing at our institutions rather than building a separate 501c3 off on the side. It's exciting for me to be here to see the research center come to fruition, because it is this culmination of a lot of energy around some ideas that we had at the outset. Now, I'm not here to talk about the research center. I'm here to talk about HathiTrust as the executive director, and to provide some context or some foundation. And I want to emphasize that I'll turn at the end to a few remarks about the research center and what I see as some possibilities, but really only a thumbnail there. So you all know about the lawsuit as well, and I understand this is being recorded. So I have to constrain what I say, and I think that's pretty much the end of my talk. So, I do want to say, for those of you who have been through the background slides, that I apologize genuinely, but I think there is so much that so many people don't know. And one of the points that we need to make here is that this has some staying power. And the slides I'm going to go into here about HathiTrust and what it's doing and where it's come from and where it's going really help emphasize that staying power. So the first thing I want to do is just put up this list of institutions. We are now, as of today, up to 70 partnering institutions, most in the United States, not all. We have a Spanish partner, a couple of Canadian partners. Recently, Virginia Tech and Kansas State joined. Later in the year, I traveled to Japan to have a conversation with the National Diet Library. There's a lot of interest and continuing interest in partnership for these institutions, but one and all are libraries, research libraries. The institutions that surround them, it's their libraries that are engaged in this, because what we see here is an opportunity to do the work, the collective work of libraries collectively, without losing that individual sense that we have of what we are and the communities that we're tied to. I want to put up this mission statement that we did from the beginning, and it was intended to be as utterly ambitious as you see here, to contribute to the common good by collecting, organizing, preserving, communicating, and sharing the record of human knowledge. And you'll notice that we don't say digital and we don't say books. It really is intended to be a foundation for so many things here, both print and electronic and other formats as well. But really what we have here is the coalescence of something that is all of our libraries. I'm going to give you some data as I go on in this presentation to emphasize that sense of collectivity, that sense of comprehensiveness, that sense of what we are as a collective and what we can do in that space. So this is really that ambitious to ensure the long-term preservation and accessibility of the cultural record writ large in the broadest sense. We haven't shied away from using this language about the universal library, even though there are skeptics in this. And of course, that is reasonable. How do you create such a comprehensive library? Well, I think we have some data that shows how much we've accomplished in this area, how we can see a goal that we've made enough progress to be able to get a better sense of what this comprehensive body would be. I've written separately about this notion of bibliographic indeterminacy. We have things like OCLC's WorldCat with hundreds of millions of records, but it really is kind of a quagmire, very difficult to discern in that what is the comprehensive body of material that we would be working with. I know personally libraries and librarians who have been cataloging book chapters as books, articles as books. We see in some studies of the OCLC data the same book cataloged many different ways, skewing those numbers a bit. But what we're doing in this, comparing it to the collections that we have as libraries, gives us a better and better sense of what the corpus is, where we can go here. So this notion of universal library, working collectively around that, a single entity without it subsuming all of our institutions. Many partners, again, that don't lose their identity in this collective work. One of the notions here that's very important is that this work can't be done alone, and that is in so many of these independent organizations, by divorcing it from what our institutions are, we lose touch with what the research is, who the researchers are, what the needs are, and by anchoring this in what we are and what we do, we're much better able to identify, serve, meet the needs of our constituencies, the various constituencies. So going back to those beginnings, we did launch in 2008, and we did very explicitly have an initial focus on digitized book and journal content. We don't see a need to let that go as we go into other areas, and there is a big challenge in dealing with the digitized book and journal content. But where are we now? 10.5 million volumes, a phenomenally large library, 5.5 million book titles, 270,000 serial titles, and roughly 3.2 million of that in the public domain. All those are facts that we've been able to ascertain through that collectivity. For example, I'll talk more about this later, in the public domain, there's just so much that we can do by looking at bibliographic information. Some of it depends on research. Some of it depends on our work in fleshing these things out. And that's something we've been able to do by bringing this body of material together and working together to identify what's in the corpus. These were our initial goals, and they remain true today. Creating a reliable and comprehensive archive of materials converted from print and co-owned. We've worked very hard on things like the TRAC certification process, the Trustworthy Repositories Audit and Certification, to be able to undergird this notion of what we're doing, to do it better by doing it collectively, and by turning the corpus of materials to meeting the needs around print. Improving access to meet the needs of the co-owning institutions. We all have needs with regard to our print collections, both the management of those materials and better handling and characterization of them. And what we've been able to do by bringing this together is make some progress there. Ensuring the long-term preservation of the content. I mentioned the TRAC certification process earlier. It's possible as a single institution to do a relatively good job of this, but by doing it together collectively, we're able to do a much better job. It's, I don't know, it's kind of like a three-legged stool, you know. We have more legs in this collaborative, and it gets done better. It is more stable. One of the things that we intended to do from the outset, and we're getting closer and closer to, is coordinating shared storage strategies. And that's not about disk drives, that's about the storage of our collections. By knowing what we have, by knowing how it relates to our print collections, some data I'm going to show you in a little bit, we're able to do a better job in storing the books in our collections. There are more than 1 billion volumes being stored in North American research libraries, and most of those are duplicated across the institutions. We're doing a reasonably good job in many contexts, but not doing the best job we could by coordinating our efforts. And part of the intent by the partnership is turning this digital collection back to understanding our print collections better. Supporting the public good, supporting creating and sustaining the public good in a way that ensures the greatest possible availability of the materials while offering value to the members, mitigating the problem of free riders. We knew that this would be a free rider issue going into it, that we could serve many while not hurting our own goals. And so we decided to make it as open as we possibly could in that context. And you'll see that as you use HathiTrust, the collection, open to everybody wherever we can lawfully, and creating a technical framework that's simultaneously responsive to their members, so meeting our needs in that centralization, and yet open so that we can share responsibility for what we're doing. So now I want to turn to this, this content distribution question here and emphasize a couple of points that come up as we understand the nature of the collection. 30% we characterize as being in the public domain. The other 70% is not in copyright but treated presumptively in copyright. We don't know the status of most of those publications. It takes some examination of those one by one, but many will be in copyright just by the nature of when they were published. So treating them presumptively as in copyright is important to understand here. They are not necessarily in copyright. We have ongoing work to determine what is in the copyright and what is in copyright and what isn't. But in that public domain body of materials, we have a number of different legal regimes, and we're paying attention to that, working with groups of copyright scholars, working with experts at our institutions to try to understand what we can do here more effectively. And that's work that goes on in an ongoing way. U.S. federal government documents is a good example. Statutorily, most are in the public domain regardless of when they're published, and we're able to treat them in that way. But there's variation in state laws, and we have now copyright scholars working with us to attend to state government publications. So roughly 15% in the public domain worldwide, a larger percentage, sorry, not a larger percentage, but a large percentage public domain in the US only. There's that big swath of US federal government documents that we open up worldwide. But look at these tiny portions down here, the 0.1% open access and 0.01% Creative Commons. I'm going to give you a few numbers as I go through this, and I think it's important to understand some of the scale issues. Making of America, one of the flagship digital library projects, was fewer than 10,000 volumes. In this area, these tiny fractions here are that. This is where rights holders have come forward, individuals, organizations, and opened access to their materials. And they do that freely, and we haven't even mounted a campaign to do that. So we have thousands and thousands of publications that individuals have opened, rights that have reverted to authors, organizations like ARL and SAA that are philosophically aligned with us, even some publishers opening up materials, even some publishers applying Creative Commons licenses to their materials. So this gives you a good sense of the content distribution there, and also part of the problem we're dealing with. We've been fortunate to be the beneficiary of a couple of grants from IMLS to do copyright determination. For 3 years, we mounted a campaign across a number of our institutions to build infrastructure to reliably, definitively make determinations about US publications, books that is, published in the United States between 1923 and 1963, and went through a couple thousand titles during that process, defining a methodology, testing that methodology against copyright renewal records that you can only examine on site at the Copyright Office, and determined 55% of those to be in the public domain. We recently received from IMLS a follow-on grant to extend and develop a new methodology across the institutions for non-US publications published in English language speaking countries and in Spain because of our Spanish partner. Very interesting to see the sort of collectivity working in this. In the first round, we had commitments from 4 institutions to do cost share and did that work across 4 institutions. It was work that was distributed and yet done in a centralized way so that we could coordinate that work across the institutions. And in the second grant, we had about 15 genuine cost share commitments going into that, and that only grows as we go on. I want to show you a little bit about content sources here. You have that big pie slice there from Michigan and California, the 45 and 33%, and then many smaller percentages there from other institutions contributing to this. But even so, in those very small slices, the 1%, they dwarf our digital library efforts of the past. Tens of thousands of volumes in a 1% slice there, as opposed to what we did in the past in those laborious digitization efforts. So we're really getting some momentum from this, this collectivity. But I also want to show you something about the date distribution to give you a sense of how this relates to our collections as a whole before at the end turning that to that sense of what this corpus is. Look at the way that the dates are distributed over time with so much of the corpus in the modern era. As we were working in digital library efforts in the past, it was usually before the 20th century, maybe in the beginnings of the 20th century, but primarily older publications that skewed our sense of what the corpus is or could be. And now we're getting something that looks more like our collections beginning in the 15th century and running right up into the present. The same with languages. This language distribution chart shows the top 10 languages here, 86% of the content, but less than 50% of the content is in English. And you see those big swaths in German, French, and Spanish. But there are over 400 languages. We've tried to clean up this slide in the past, and it's impossible, right? So this is the next 40 languages. There are over 40 languages. So you even take a small piece of the collection like Urdu at 3%, and it dwarfs early digital library efforts. We're getting something that looks like our libraries. That's very important to understand here. So go back to that slide I showed a minute ago with the big swaths from Michigan and California. And this is a longitudinal representation. You see the first two institutions depositing content were Michigan and Wisconsin, the green bit there that stays relatively constant. But as the collection grows, as more institutions come in, as more content comes in, that distribution changes over time. It becomes richer and richer, broader and broader as we build a more and more comprehensive body of materials. This services slide is something that we have been using for a long time, and I wanted to use it for a couple of reasons. One, to emphasize the breadth of what we intend to do here, but also to include that bullet that has been here from the beginning of our enterprise, the establishment of a research center, the importance of supporting research. So long-term preservation, bit level migration, those things you would expect to find in an archive, bibliographic search, solid bibliographic search in the repository with a strong sense of what's there. You've read about Google's metadata train wreck, I think was the great title that Jeff Nunberg applied to what they were doing with invented metadata. That's not what we're doing. We're using the records that come from our institutions. Of course there are errors, but they are our errors, and they're ones that we can own proudly and correct over time, as opposed to imputed errors like figuring the date of publication from a stamp inside the cover from a Harvard book. Full text search, Tom Burton West back here and others engaged in a very, very significant research effort to scale full text search to a body of materials like this. This was uncharted territory for our community outside of Google, searching billions and billions of pages like this expeditiously, giving people that kind of balance between precision and recall is something that was really undeveloped, and we did a lot of work there to make that possible, to support search over the entire body of materials, whether in the public domain or not. Reading and download capabilities, everything that we can support reading lawfully for every audience we can support lawfully reading it is accessible online. We have large scale, hundreds of thousands of volumes in print on demand. You're not unlikely to encounter books in Amazon that come from HathiTrust partner institutions, building collections. When you have this ocean of material, it's important to be able to circumscribe things and use them in meaningful ways. So those of you who are librarians may know the English short title catalog, that body of materials that is from the beginning of printing in the English language until the 18th century. We're doing work to bring that bibliography together with the materials in the collection. And then ultimately support for research. We knew that this would be a great foundation for research and was something we wanted to support right from the outset, both distributing data sets but also coalescing things around a research center. So I want to show you a slide from an earlier analysis by Constant Malpas and Roy Tennant at OCLC Research to make a point that I want to come back to several times. This was a time analysis study of the overlap of the volumes in HathiTrust with ARL libraries, showing what percentage of those ARL libraries collections were represented in HathiTrust. So first in June 2009, 19%, and then in June 2010, 31%. That trend, and you see also, I'm going to take a chance here and get the feedback, from Harvard on one end to Howard on the other, the largest to the smallest ARL. And you see the clustering in that scattergram there, the consistency across the board, and how fairly level it is, surprisingly level despite that diversity of institutions. As we added more content and added more unique content, it's my impression that the line became a little bit more horizontal, but it's only grown. It's only increased over time. And now we have the sense that more than 50% of every ARL library is represented, its print collection is represented in HathiTrust. This is a phenomenal thing. It is very important. The weight of this enterprise is significant in understanding that. And if you look at small college libraries, it's nearly 10% more of their collections. We see more variety there, but it is very significant. This was another piece of Constance's analysis comparing what was in HathiTrust with some of the largest shared book repositories, and 75% of that HathiTrust collection was in those shared storage repositories, shared print storage repositories. So we're seeing that coalescence of things going into this. So now I want to emphasize some of this for collection management. Again, to give that, to emphasize that notion of weight, the weight of this enterprise, the staying power of this enterprise. This is not something that's an idea that is waiting to happen. It is happening and has been happening. So more than 50% median overlap with the ARL libraries, higher for small liberal arts colleges. That makes this very important to us as we do our work. We are moving into a new cost model beginning next year and have been communicating that to the partners. Moving from a depositor pays model with an exploratory model for those sustaining partner institutions that are not depositing content to one that looks at overlap with the partner institutions to build in a sense of fairness. That has required of us the building of a print holdings database, something that has not existed previously. Let me assure you that OCLC WorldCat is not such a thing. So now we have a sense of the relationship of the repository to the partner institutions and what we can do there. This also supports our expansion of legal, lawful uses of the materials. So for example, services for users with print disabilities, something we feel very strongly about, building on that body of materials, extending those services to those users. There are other lawful uses that we can see in this body of material. And then this notion of individual and collaborative collection development and management operations, what we can do relative to that body of materials, what we can do collectively, for example, in the CIC, but other institutions together also working individually and collectively working on problems like print archiving. Discovery and use, all the collections, all the collection being searchable, the building of collections, online access, very important. There are a number of very vital APIs that we've built and that institutions and individuals build services around. A data API to get content out. The bibliographic API for libraries to build their services around. We build on a daily basis and accumulate monthly something called the HathiTrust files that allows institutions to do analysis of the materials. One line for every volume in the collection, so 10.5 million lines there, updated frequently, and supports that notion of distributed work without any coordination, open there for everybody, OAI, and then the computational work here. So from the beginning we saw 3 distinct possibilities, and we've been working on at least 2 of them, the first and the third. The distribution of data sets, many individuals receiving the data sets for their work in distributed ways, but also, lastly, the research center. We'd like to see protocol-based research and think that we can do some things, for example, with the solar indexes here. So I want to just say a few words about the research center in context. This is one of the things that we realized in building HathiTrust was that it was not solving a single problem. It was not devoted to a single purpose. Bringing materials together in this way allows us to do a number of things. Services for users with print disabilities, for example, is a good example. When we force a blind user or another print disabled user to know what he or she wants before undertaking the work of converting the materials, they lose the kind of serendipity or exploratory capabilities that the rest of us have with a collection. And by building this comprehensive body, we can begin to provide services like that. That's just one example. This comprehensiveness allows us to do many things. The Research Center is another example of what can happen when you have that rich, broad corpus. Print management, too. What I described earlier in copyright determination is another example as well. Research goes back in the humanities. I used to be a member of the executive committee of the Association for Computing in the Humanities in a previous life. We've done lots of things in this area with lots of bodies of material, but it's usually been selective. It's usually been scoped in some way that forces us to ignore, allows us to scope to specific things, but forces us to ignore other things. And what we can see now and the possibilities presented through the Research Center is leveraging that comprehensiveness, that body of materials to do more, greater, and better things. I alluded to this notion of the weight of the enterprise, and I want to emphasize this as I get close to wrapping up here, that sustainability is a critical thing here. We have a lot of initiatives in the offing, DPLA, DEEPN, the Academic Preservation Trust, a lot of ideas that are not fully gelled yet, are important, but really aren't entirely shaped in terms of where we want to take them. This is something that has legs. It has the substantial investment of the participating institutions, in part because they can see what they get from it. In October 2011, about a year ago, we had a planned constitutional convention. We said to the partners going into this in 2008, 3 years in, we'll stop. We'll stop and check where we are, see what we're doing, try to frame what happens after the first 5 years. Everybody commit to 5 years, but let's figure out what we do next. And everybody that's a partner by October 2010 gets a vote, comes to this constitutional convention and decides where we go next. There were 52 partner institutions at that point, and they came together in Washington, D.C. Where else would you have a constitutional convention? And worked on that sense of where we go next. There was a 3-year review that was undertaken by a strategic advisory board that we built in the beginning and presented conclusions. But there were a number of ballot proposals solicited from the partners and voted on there at the convention. And many of them were approved unanimously or nearly unanimously. These are some of the important ones that came out of it. And in so many ways, what this did was to reaffirm what we were there for. A print monograph storage proposal, building on what we had done to coordinate our efforts around storing print books. an approval process for development initiatives, a renewed commitment to try to get the corpus of U.S. federal government documents digitized, a mechanism for fee for deposit for non-partner institutions that wanted to see their material preserved, and shaping new governance. Probably more important to anybody else there was that sense of governance, and that was one of the unanimously supported ballot initiatives, and we have since then shaped the new governance process, and the new Board of Governors, 12 members, has started to meet in preparation for what happens next, the next 5 years. So we go from this model of a small core executive committee with a strategic advisory board, the executive committee doing work on budget and finances, to this 12-member board, 6 members from the founding institutions, and 6 voted from the partnership. An idea that really was embraced by the folks who came there, and we're in the process now of establishing bylaws, or in the final phases of that, and we'll be ready next year for shaping where we go next with that Board of Governors. I mentioned earlier the new pricing model. This is really intended to get at this notion of how we benefit from the repository. Every partner institution shares equally in the cost of the public domain. Frankly, it probably gives us some incentive to expanding our notion of the public domain, because it drives down the cost for all of us. But for those in copyright volumes, we each pay relative to overlap of those in copyright digitized volumes with our own copies. So for example, if it costs 19 cents per year per volume to preserve the content in HathiTrust, and there are 19 volumes that hold a corresponding print volume for an in-copyright volume in the repository, each of the institutions will pay 1 cent. That's the idea, and it results in a fairly complex set of calculations across all the millions of volumes in all the 70 institutions. That's how we get to this new sense of cost and fairness in the enterprise. And really, I think what it does is reflect costs in ways that are relative to the resources of the co-owning institutions. Makes it much more, I think, much more palatable, easy to sustain as we go forward, and really gives us a good foundation. It also helps us fund programmatic initiatives, and that's something we've begun to do, is build a fund for those future initiatives. So where do we go next? Well, I think the things that I'd like to emphasize for you all, we do have this very solid foundation, but the most important things going forward are growth of content, not just the past but the future. There are several million volumes out there that we could bring into the repository. There are things limiting our ability to bring those volumes in, not technical, but sometimes will, sometimes legal. The CIC institutions, for example, have a large body of materials in escrow with Google and need to work through very difficult contract changes to be able to get those out of escrow, and that will change the composition of the repository fairly substantially overnight. I say in copyright, and again, it's that notion of presumptive in copyright. We did at one point early on bring in a large body of presumptively in copyright materials, ones that Google was treating in copyright from one partner institution in the CIC, and began to do the copyright renewal testing on that, and found that 44% of those were in the public domain as well. So a great opportunity in that to build out both the comprehensiveness of the repository and the public domain. Several more million volumes at other institutions like Stanford, Texas, Virginia, and Harvard. Growth of the partnership. At any given day, when I ask Jeremy York back there what's going on with contracts, we have probably 10 or more institutions working on contracts coming in. That's a number that doesn't change. It's always there. They're coming in, and we add more government agencies, more institutions from other parts of the world. The growth of services, more that we can do in the way of building services around that. And I would say also fighting the good fight in defining what we can do reasonably and lawfully with these materials, giving shape to responsible fair use and preservation in a large-scale context, what this can do for our libraries in this. I also mentioned earlier, not just the past, but the future. We have a number of important conversations going on with a number of publishers bringing materials in, not in a portico style, dark archiving in return for darkness, but archiving in return for openness in this repository, what they can open up. We're glad to bring in and share the cost of that among the partners. A wonderful thing. So I'm going to wrap up so I can field maybe like 2.5 questions. I think back to those early days when I was involved in computing in the humanities and what we talked about in corpus linguistics with hundreds of millions of words, and now we have a corpus that is over 4 billion pages. We really have changed the shape of things, billions of pages. About 12 years ago, somebody wrote, the problem with any of the thematic research collections at the Institute for Advanced Technology in the Humanities, and for every place for that matter, is that a collection is bounded by its own logical and institutional structures in ways we would hope the digital library will not be, in ways that producers of the collection will inevitably care about more than users do. And I think this is John Unsworth here writing 12 years ago. This is absolutely true. And I think what we've been able to do in bringing this body of materials together is to get beyond that thematic narrowness, to make all sorts of things possible. Where are we now? Well, closer than ever before. Not close enough, though, I would add. Consider the numbers I've talked about, the breadth and complexity of HathiTrust. More than 50% of any ARL, more than most liberal arts college collections, this vast array of languages. If we go back to Michigan, from which most of the materials were drawn, and look at the collection analysis there, it's more than 70% of Michigan's print book collection. Well, that is a phenomenal thing, and I think that any scholar in corpus linguistics would agree that having a great research library so comprehensively digitized gives an unbounded sense of the possibilities. But we should always ask what's missing here. And I did have staff do a little bit of analysis on how this skews, how it differs from our collection now. The things that have been held out, the things that have been prevented from coming in are overwhelmingly English language, overwhelmingly in the last few years, overwhelmingly books. And those things are not true of this corpus as a whole, and they're not true of our library collections. So keep in mind that there is some skew that I believe we can correct, but that's embedded in this great opportunity and also, I think, work ahead of us. So that's it. I wanted to emphasize the foundation we've laid for the Research Center in doing this. And Beth, do I have time for a couple of questions?
Yes.
Yeah. Andrew.
Hi. I wanted to ask about, you mentioned the HathiTrust not being just another 503c again. If you could say a little bit more about how HathiTrust differs from other library organizations as a model, and maybe more potential down the road for furthering the distributive aspect.
Right, so Andrew was asking about this comment I made about not being just another 501c3 and how we get the work done. And there's another version of this talk where we have slides about how the work is done among the institutions. I wouldn't rule out some 50c3-ness in the future, but it would be probably a very, very small central organization with the work continuing to be primarily at our institutions. It's a hard slog getting that to happen. We need each of us to see the way that we have some benefit from doing the work in this context as opposed to, say, exclusively back home. The copyright review management system is a good example of that. Technical services staff, copyright experts, public services staff working on that, doing the work of making the determinations not for some greater good, but for what then redounds to their benefit. They get the benefits of those public domain determinations. So we are in that greater than the sum of our parts, and I think that's one of the ways that that happens. There are lots of examples of ways that we are in this working outside of our institutions for things that we recognize come back to the value of our institutions. Paul Fogel over there at CDL has been doing a lot of work on a lot of different areas in collection analysis, and other CDL staff have been working on things like a bibliographic metadata management system to extend our capabilities and do better with what we're doing with bibliographic metadata. They're doing that really because of the way that they see this benefiting their institution. So it's not easy to find those ways into doing that work collectively, but that's exactly what we're doing. We're doing this work from our institutions for collective good.
I'm from Texas, Texas A&M, and we're about to contribute some content to you all where we're going to be taking care of clearing copyright for state agency docs. And I was wondering, we had thought about trying to do it with a CC license, but given the importance of reuse and whatnot, will you only accept content under a CC license if it's CC BY? Because the agencies are not convinced
Right.
that that's an
Right.
appropriate.
Now, I want to emphasize the sort of openness across the board here. We manage things, everything with a rights database and have a large number of different types of rights declarations in the repository. Some of the rights declarations are that the work is in copyright and the rights holder has granted use. Nothing more than that, granted use worldwide of the materials. The CC licenses are useful because it's so widely understood. It's not an ad hoc license, but we've got every manner of representation of rights there and accept many different types of rights. The university presses are generally doing CCNC licenses, and that's good enough for Google to let go of the digitized files that they created for them. And that's one of the things we're parlaying. So if your university press has volumes that were digitized by Google and are in the repository as a result of this collective action, and with Duke we found that was something like 85% of their entire publishing output, they can get them freed up for their own uses by applying a CCNC license. Yes? Jennifer, you're going to have to shout.
I will shout. Can you just say something about Hathi and DPLA?
We continue to be engaged with DPLA. It's often hard, since DPLA hasn't defined exactly what it is, to know how we would relate to it. But most of the conversations that I'm privy to seem to be going in the direction of something Europeana-like, which would be a hub of metadata rather than a repository of content. And if that's the case, then there's a lot that we can do to feed that hub of metadata. Now, we don't have more liberal rights in the metadata than the institutions partnering with HathiTrust do. We gather the metadata from the partner institutions, and we're subject to the same constraints that they are with OCLC. That presents an interesting problem because though we may be able to do an ODC BY license according to OCLC, DPLA wants a CC0 license for metadata. Michigan has applied the CC0 license to the 800,000 records that Michigan has created. If other institutions do the same thing, then we're freed up. So not saying that there aren't complications, but there's a lot that we can do in supporting that hub notion. DPLA also intends to secure funds for digitization, and it's hard to know how that will happen, but I imagine that they'll do coordination of digitization. And if they can coordinate with the known body of digitized content, boy, we got a great foundation for that too. We know what the gaps are, and we can focus on the things that are rarer and not represented in the repository. Somebody back in the back.
What sort of relationship do you have with the Internet Archive?
We don't have a special relationship with the Internet Archive, but the partner institutions may be IA partners. And so we gather material together from any source that we can. So there are Microsoft partner institutions that have contributed content from that digitization effort. IA partners, California, Paul, what, 300,000 volumes? 200,000. I'm sorry? 200,000. 200,000, right. And then other IA partners have put IA content in. A lot of local digitization in preservation reformatting efforts in other areas. Of course, a lot of Google digitized content. So we don't have any more relationship than that, but we continue to have cordial conversations about what we can do and give them feedback on extraction mechanisms and metadata and things like that. Paul.
I just wanted to say that the pipeline from the Internet Archive HathiTrust is very smooth now. It didn't used to be, and just wanted to say that it's easy to get stuff from IA to Hathi.
There are a few areas where things just come in, and IA and Google are two of them. I can say, as a long-time digital library guy, I think our focus on best practices has not always been our best friend. So we have, every variation on the universe of the way that things are represented, and though things like Bagot allow you to get a bag of content, it doesn't help you understand the content necessarily, and so we're dealing with a lot of heterogeneity and local digitization efforts, but it's really, really nice to see that content coming in, even if it's harder.
You alluded to
Eric.
a different sustainability model.
Yep.
So if 19 institutions, and it costs 19 cents, then each one of those institutions will pay a penny.
Right.
Okay, but now I have a thing and nobody else owns it, and it
Yes.
costs 19 cents. Don't you think that that will deter me from adding more unique items to your collection?
No, I don't. And the reason I don't is that the institutions are committed to, yeah, right, are committed to preserving those items. And so Michigan, with the largest body, and California with the second largest body of unique content, are not dissuaded from going forward into this because they're getting those preservation services around the content that only they and one other, or only they and two other institutions own. So the cost is relatively high. But again, what I was saying earlier is that it really does align with institutional resources and mission. Those institutions wouldn't be in it if they weren't collections of records. So it's working out well.
Well, not only that, I would imagine if it costs you 19 cents to preserve that one item, that institution, though, it might cost them a quarter. And so it might be cheaper.
It's cheaper. We found that we get better scaling in the enterprise. Costs are being driven down. We've gotten better than industry spec on storage costs by doing it in large aggregation, seeing the cost driven down. More than 10% per year in cost reductions have benefited from that. And as more institutions come in, there is greater and greater likelihood of another institution overlapping with that volume. So it's a good model. You get some momentum there. Are you gonna give me the hook?
Yeah. All right.
Thank you.